this is kind of the point of the walk, trying to find these smaller streets off the larger streets that's part of a network that's still there in some ways, but a shadow network under the main roads that we use all the time. So down there is Surrey Lane, which you can access during the week, but it belongs to King's College, which is the other side of here, all these King's College buildings. And it looks like older London, doesn't it? So if you go down there, it's very 19th century in feel. And at a lower level, if you're walking up a slope here, this is the line of stream that once ran from the higher ground up near the Thames. And it's separated out different large houses. So Somerset House on that side, and other mansions on this side. So boundary, and so the boundary between parishes, St Clement Danes, which is where we're ending up in that direction, and Mary the Strand that way. So a lost watercourse that still shapes the city, even though it's not been seen above ground for many years. But it's also the location of the Roman Bath, which is possibly the National Trust's least valued property, because it's not Roman, it's not a bath, but they ended up being given it. So around the corner down there, behind a very dirty window, there's a series of stone basins and Tudor brick work, which were part of, we now think, a cistern that fed the fountains in the gardens of Somerset House in that direction. So it's not what it seemed to be, but it was remarketed during the 18th and 19th centuries as Roman baths, and people were charged to access the baths and to use them. So it was actually used as a bath, but much more recently. And then it was donated to the National Trust, who I think probably couldn't say no, and then had their suspicions about what it actually was, and their suspicions were confirmed. So it's a very odd little property. You can only get to it by emailing Westminster City Council or speaking to a rather grumpy guy who's responsible for it. But it's probably worth doing that, because nobody really does. But if you walk along there, you'll find yourself coming up at the Strand at a much lower level, and you can see around us the ground level has changed. So as layers of building have gone on, it's risen. It's higher than it once was. And then sloped down to the embankment, which extends the riverbank out from where the Thames once flowed. So it's a whole kind of shadow landscape under here. It's at a different level, different shape, and it's been developed on, built on, layered up, which is what happens across all of central London. Many layers of development, demolition, rebuilding. We can see that happening around us now. A very large project over here, which is, I don't know, sort of lacking in any distinctive character, really, which is probably better than it might have been, but it's very kind of international architecture. This is looking like something that could be anywhere in the world. So there is a bit of that going on. But as you'll see as we go around the corner onto the Strand, there's also a really remarkable bit of public realm improvement, which some of you may know. Over the last couple of years, the Strand has been pedestrianised, and it's really quite something. So that is a good place to tell you more about the context of the Strand, the Aldwych, and what it's been built on top of, what streets have disappeared that were once under these large thoroughfares that we know really well.
From Aldwych station there, that was. Used for filming these days, what's left of it?
Strand, but it's not, as you would imagine it to be. It's a pedestrianised stretch running up past King's College on this side and around St Mary the Strand Church behind us. And this is quite recent, last couple of years. It's quite a revolutionary bit of public realm redesign. So this is a very busy one-way street, one-way system going along here and around the curve of the Aldwych, which is a crescent on the other side. So cutting some bit off, giving pedestrians priority here is, I think, probably a first, because this has always been a key London movement route. This is the link between St Paul's and Westminster. So the cities of London and Westminster, the route that takes you from one to the other goes along here. And this is sort of, in some ways, in between place. You think, well, where is this? It's Aldwych, but Aldwych is something that was only built 125 years ago. It's not the city, because the city starts over there. It's not Covent Garden, because that's over there. It's sort of sitting in between. And it's somewhere that had an identity that's very important to London. It's sort of vanished over a long period of time. It was the Anglo-Saxon market centre of the city. So when the Romans left London, it was probably abandoned, it's thought, for a couple of hundred years. And then in the early 600s, we start to find signs that Anglo-Saxons had moved into the city, started to use its spaces and create something distinctive. And there are two Anglo-Saxon centres. There's the fort of London on the site of the city, Londonburg, as it's known by archaeologists, historians, and London Wick, which is the market centre down here. And that's only really known about from the 1980s, when the archaeology told us a lot more about what's really here. So it's kind of amazing, really, that we've only discovered something so fundamental about why London is in this place that recently. But the Wick bit, which means market, has been transferred to different places around here over time, linking this back to its original function. So Aldwych is a recreation of that. Aldwych, a kind of deliberately antiquated street name. When the Aldwych was built, it was given a one-word name to give it the same sort of status as the Strand, or there are other examples, I can't remember what they are. Other streets around London that sound, thank you, yes, Piccadilly, yeah. Streets that sound significant because they've only got one word as their name. So Aldwych, Kingsway, deliberately named like that to make them sound like part of the ancient city. But they're not really, because they're very modern creations. These buildings around us, on this side of the road, are all from the same era, and they're built within the crescent of the Aldwych. They're very formal buildings. The Aldwych itself was constructed for embassies and theatres and large institutions. And then Kingsway, which runs dead straight 3/4 of a mile that direction, 100 feet wide, is offices, big office buildings of various sorts. So it's very structured. And then you've got this set of churches. So one here, St Mary the Strand, and one at the other end, which is, you can't really see because it's behind those hoardings, but will end up there. And they always sat in the Strand, so the Strand ran past them, and streets ran parallel to the Strand on the other side. So they've always been kind of islands. This became a real traffic island until this scheme was put in place. But those streets were demolished when the Aldwych was built. The whole neighbourhood was cleared, and when we walk up Drury Lane in a moment, I'll tell you more about the nature of that neighbourhood and what kind of a place it was. But this is modern London from the early 1900s. It was an idea of a rational city, a place that had been designed for modern functions. So there was a lot of influence of Haussmann and his redesign of Paris, the Haussmann boulevards, wide, straight, no kind of hiding places. So it's about managing a place, but it's also about what modernity looks like. And there were a lot of discussions around here about the connection, why you needed something to take you from the bottom of Southampton Row, which is half of the route up to Euston Road, down to here. Lots of tangled streets in between, no clear route through. And from the mid-19th century, there was a great deal of discussion about how that could be improved, how you could build a road through to get traffic across, to make a logical connection across a bit of London that's quite hard to navigate. And that was often tied to ideas about building a new city hall. So there were two separate proposals for a new city hall here on the Strand and slightly further up towards Great Queen Street in Covent Garden. And Kingsway itself is designed as a three-level street. The only real attempt to do that in the UK. So you've got traffic on the surface, you've got tram tunnel underneath, which still survives in two different sections, which we'll see later. And there was also a hydraulic system which sent messages from office to office. Before the telegraph, telephone systems were developed far enough to be effective, hydraulic packages were a very popular way of communicating in cities. They had a lot less in Paris too. So they built it into the Kingsway structure as well. So a hyper-modern street. But this being London, there are great grand visions never quite get delivered. So the idea of doing this for the city, rebuilding it, making it more rational, never materialised. So Kingsway and Aldwych feel like they're out on their own. They feel isolated from the place around them because they're an experiment that never really extended beyond these particular routes. So we'll walk up here, cross over Aldwych and go up Drury Lane, talk about Theatreland and the history of that a bit.
Right, so we've got Kingsway. Aldwych Station is actually called the Strand. You should go up Kingsway, straight up Kingsway, closed in about 1938. I'm walking tour here. Open house.
Where are you? at Kingston, Lincoln's Inn Fields, and we're now in what is effectively now the LSE campus. So the main LSE buildings are that way, but all these buildings around us are built by the LSE, and that's really developed over the last 20 years.
LSE.
So I remember working across the road, going to the old Yieldy White Horse pub around the corner, back there, and it had a sign on the door saying "No students," which I don't know, I sort of admired it. But the LSE bought that pub and bought everything else, so it's a bit of a power. I mean, it's commissioning some astonishing architecture. So this behind us is the Marshall Building by Grafton Architects, Irish firm. And in particular, if you go inside, the ground floor is open to the public. It's got a really good cafe in, you can work in there, and it's not that obvious on the outside, but it's one of the best spaces built in London in the last 5 years. It's got really amazing concrete interiors, really expressive, very powerful. This is a great building. I mean, the LSE is always upsides and downsides. It's funded by Sir Paul Marshall, who is main funder of GB News, and is, to say the least, a controversial character. So having his name all over this it's kind of the epitome, really, of the way that a lot of universities fund things these days. I mean, a number of other buildings have funders you can take issue with as well. But this building behind us, which is a bit older, but not that much older, this is the Student Union, and that's by O'Donnell and Toomey, another Irish firm, who are excellent, Sterling Prize shortlisted, as are Grafton actually recently. So they're commissioning the best architects, not just the architects with the biggest names, but the best architects to do this work. But this is quite recent, and it's part of a really narrow set of streets. You can see around us the scale of it suddenly change. And the old Curiosity Shop building is sort of characteristic of that. Although it's a tourist attraction rather than what it seems. So there's no demonstrable connection to Dickens. That's probably the most important thing to know. And it's not as old as it says. I think I shouldn't say that anymore. Before it was restored, it used to say, I think, built in 1567. But it wasn't. It was built in the mid-17th century, which is fair enough. And it's been various things. It was 2 houses to start with, and then it's been other sorts of shops, a dairy, I think, a bookbinder, a Dickens shop at some point, unsurprisingly. So it's a curiosity in itself, but it's really a sign of the way that people wanted to build on Dickens' reputation at the time, how big he was, the kind of industry that began to develop almost immediately around his stories. And there are plenty of places in London that can be directly related to Dickens, and he was a London author in every way, but not this one, ironically enough. So I don't think the LSE knows to do with it. It's surprising. But the area around us is part of the Clare Market slum, as was, cut in half by Kingsway. And Clare Market is actually the main street that the LSE is based on now. And that's where the butchers was, that's where the market was, 150 years of butchery and meat sales there. It later went downhill though, so it wasn't what it used to be by the late 19th century. And people started to write about the kind of place this had become, and to talk about it being dangerous, potentially depressing. They finding the right quote here. There's a handy quote about how awful it was in people's minds. A noticeable absence of happiness in the streets, wrote somebody in the 1880s. But I think there's 2 sides to this, I'm sure. There's a social survey called Booth Survey, which goes street by street through central London and further out in the 1880s and 1890s, making notes on the kind of places they are. And it passes judgments about the kind of social status the streets have, but it also provides notes to describe why they think that, so you can pick it apart a bit. But some of the streets around here were described as consisting entirely of houses of ill fame of the worst description, stored with the foulest moral pollution. And there were people on the streets around here were described as often drunk, and there were a lot of abandoned women, old and young, decked in tawdry finery, bloated with gin and debauchery. Which tells you something both about the place and about the people who were writing about it. But broadly, this was a poor area, and when the streets began to be demolished, there was surprisingly little opposition, direct opposition from people who lived here. But the booth surveyors who were walking around here said that people would approach them and say, don't knock these houses down unless you can give us new ones to live in. That was the main concern, I think. But at the time, people were also talking about the working population of London, and they described them as living in Westminster and here. This was a place where working people lived in central London. It's notable for that. So, in some ways, its time was going, and this is becoming a more office-based, less residential part of the world. But the opportunity really was there because it was somewhere that was seen as having a bad reputation and being a problem that needs to be solved. So that's the reason that this change came. But the streets are still here on this side of the road. So the atmosphere of the LSE is a bit of a warren. It's something that you really can't miss. It feels completely different. So if we walk that way through a bit more of the warren, I'll tell you a bit more about the place and what it's like. Wait for us to come back up this way.
Open house walk here around Aldwych. Walk into it here.
Here because this is Drury Lane, so we're standing outside the stage door of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, which is the oldest theatre site in the area, and it's, as you can see, very tall, so you can get scenery in. It's actually used for something else now. They didn't take it in this way, but nevertheless, you can see when it's open, you can see inside the workings, backstage workings of the place, which is really cool. So we're now in theatre land, and on the west side of Kingsway. Kingsway's just over there, as we'll find out in a minute. And the streets around Drury Lane were developed after the Civil War, so this was all empty space between the City of London and the City of Westminster. It was actually built over from the 1660s. First of all, there were large houses here, including a house that belonged to the Earl of Essex, where he plotted against Elizabeth I. So it was on Drury Lane that these historical events, you don't think it was having a location, but they were happening around here because this is where aristocrats lived, where you could find space to build a house with grounds. And then those were sold and subdivided, and people started to develop the area with streets. And it became more and more built up during the course of the 18th century. And this is when the theatre world began, as we recognise it from now. So after the Civil War, theatres were brought back. They were given permission to operate again. They'd been banned during Cromwell's reign. And this is where they started. It's partly because there were already cockpits around Drury Lane. It was known for cockpits and for real tennis courts. So there were structures you could use as a theatre. So the first theatres that sprang up around here, some on the other side of Kingsway and some this side around Drury Lane, were in these existing structures. And the De Vere tennis courts were the first real modern theatre that we could identify. It's where the first performances took place in the 1660s that had women on stage acting. And it's where Charles II went to the theatre for the first time, and he's known to have met Nell Gwynn around here. There's a quote from Samuel Pepys about how he walked up Drury Lane and saw Nell Gwynn standing in her doorway looking out, and thought she was very pretty. So she was kind of a feature of the street. She was visible in the area because it was a much smaller city, and all the actors lived around here. So the more respectable actors lived on the Common Garden side, people like Charles Kemble later on, Colin Kibber around the time of the early theatres. But the people who were less well paid and weren't stars lived on this side in smaller streets that led all the way down to the LSE. So back alleys, areas that were not particularly large in terms of the plot sizes, so the houses are quite small, the lodgings are quite cramped, and there's a lot else going on around here. So I'll explain more about that when we get to Clare Market and the kind of area it became, much less respectable than it had been 100 years before. The other thing to note down here is that this is an area where there's been entertainment from early on. So there was a maypole on the Strand, down just at the bottom of Drury Lane, where it met the Strand. The other side of the Aldwych was the site of the Maple Alley, and this is something that is now basically forgotten, but it was 130 feet high apparently. It was made of timber, and it was first recorded in the mid 1700s, and then by the early 1800s it had to be replaced because it was wooden and it was rotting. But it had 2 gilt balls on top and a weather vane, a big kind of landmark feature. And unfortunately it rotted again and had to be taken down, and was bought by Isaac Newton, who took it out to Wanstead and used it to mount the world's largest telescope on, which he'd invented. So it had a weird afterlife, but the site of the maypole is a symbolic site for London that's now completely vanished. No commemoration, no location for it at all. It was well known at the time. People lamented the disappearance of the maypole and said that time takes everything with it, including the maypole, with what is London now. So it's the start of a reputation for entertainment that's attached to the area ever since, and it's still Theatreland. So we're going to walk up Campbell Street. We're going to take a left through the estate, but be kind of quiet about it because we're not really supposed to do that. It's open to the public. So we just stopped by Space House, which is a fairly iconic bit of 60s architecture. It's being refurbished, which has taken a while, but I think they've nearly finished. They have been having events in there recently. So this is by Richard Seaford, and you can see that it's like a folded version of Centre Point to some extent, the same kind of window profiles with these projecting elements in between. It's also very closely related to number 1 Croydon, which is by East Croydon Station, which is something that you really notice as you come through. So this is a replacement for buildings that were on site from the original Kingsway. We're going to walk up Kingsway in a moment, and we'll see the Edwardian facades running most of the way up the street. This is a chunk that was replaced, but this frontage building is trying to recreate the same presence on Kingsway, so big monumental office buildings. It was built for the Civil Aviation Authority, who were there until very recently, but it also had other government departments in. Treasury solicitors were based here. So you've got this frontage building maintaining continuity of Kingsway as this long straight road, and then this fairly flamboyant round building behind it, connected by this bridge in the middle. And as you come through the Peabody Estate, it's a fairly astonishing view, really. The 19th century social housing with this behind it. And I think this is something that's increasingly appreciated now. This is high quality brutalist architecture of the kind that 25 years ago was dismissed. So this building is being done up because it's worth it. People want to base themselves here. It's got a future, which it didn't have, I think, a generation ago. But as a part of Kingsway, it's like Quincy Ridge, because the rest of the street is really quite unified. In some ways it's pretty boring, I have to say. I don't think it's anybody's favourite part of London, Kingsway. It's relentless. It's got a lot of traffic, it's quite hard to cross because it's got these barriers in the middle, and it's got one sort of building all the way along, and that really is a very London characteristic. So you can tell it's a street that was created in one go as a pre-planned part of the city. And I think it's as a curiosity, alongside things we're going to see over the road, that's fine, but as a concept for a whole place, it would be a bit much. Certainly for London. I mean, Paris does a lot more of this and pulls it off, maybe. So what we're going to do is walk up Kingsway, cross over, and go down a street called Remnant Street. And it's called Remnant Street because it's only part of the street that used to cross all the way from Covent Garden to Lincoln's Inn Fields, cut in half by the construction of Kingsway. And Remnant Street is a very accurate description of what's left. So we'll walk along that and we'll go through an archway into Lincoln's Inn Fields, and I'll explain the place that's disappeared, or why this street is here, what's not there anymore as a result. Lincoln's Inn Fields, and it's much the largest area of open space around here. It's the only area that wasn't developed between Westminster over there and the city over there when building started in the late 17th century. And a lot of this has been rebuilt, but it's a very impressive formal square still. It's planned by Inigo Jones, and there are rumours that it's sized to match the dimensions of the base of the Great Pyramid. Although I think that may be untrue. I might want to forget that it's untrue and think that it's true, because I like the idea. Often the else, it gives you an idea of how big the Great Pyramid is.
Pyramids.
So there's a lot around here. This is a well-known spot, but in a moment we're going to go into some alleyways over there, which aren't that well-known at all in the scheme of things, unless you go to LSE. So the big attraction on Lincoln's Inn Fields is the John Soane Museum over there, which I expect most of you already know about. But if you don't, you should very much go, probably after this walk. It really is possibly the #1 architectural destination in London. It's brilliant in every way. Really unclassifiably strange house full of John Soane's collections and objects, but designed in such a way that it's a labyrinth of mirrors and strange spaces. So that's my pitch to them. But this is part of a neighbourhood that was sliced in half by the Aldwych. So Remnant Street that we walked across was a connection through, and there were lots of streets that connected across the site of Kingsway and across the route of the Aldwych. So these were places that were demolished almost in their entirety. A lot of things disappeared from 1900 or so, when demolition began. It took a long time to clear the streets for construction work. So I think they started in 1899 actually, and they finished by 1905. So 6 years of just demolition. And along the Strand there was London's largest hoarding, filling up the space that the Aldwych would subsequently fill, which was a big feature at the time. It was enormous advertisements on it. It was like a supersized Piccadilly Circus advertisement board, and that was there for years. So quite a feature of the time. But buildings that were demolished as part of the construction process included the Sardinian Embassy Chapel on Campbell Street, which we walked up, which was the centre of Roman Catholicism in London when it was essentially illegal. So under the cover of the Sardinian Embassy, people would go to Catholic services, and it was attacked in anti-Catholic riots more than once. The church was demolished, Church of Holy Trinity on Little Queen Street, although that was afterwards. They tried to keep it, but the Piccadilly line undermined its foundations, so it come down. But they also knocked down the Gaiety Theatre, the Globe Theatre, the Opera Comique, the Olympic Theatre, one of the Inns of Court, the New Inn, which was down at the bottom next to where the Aldwych comes out by St Clement Danes Church, where we'll go in a moment. And that was one of the ancient medieval inns. And numerous streets, which I'll talk about a bit more further along. But this is the formal bit of the neighbourhood. That way, the streets were tangled, so hard to find your way through. And as a result, people were generally a bit suspicious of it. And then some of them gained reputation for crime and general dirt and poverty over the course of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And apart from anything else, there was a shambles in Clare Market, which was a butcher's and slaughterhouse operation. So several hundred ox and sheep were being slaughtered there every week. And that's the kind of thing that even the Victorians began to find a bit problematic. In a city that was extremely filthy, they realised that live slaughter in central London was not the modern way to do things, and they moved Smithfield and the shambles from places like this out to new modern markets. But by that time, the place had gained a reputation as being a problem. And I think it's interesting to consider how the Victorians dealt with problems like this. So there were a lot of what they described as slums at the time, or rookeries, in central London, and many of them were dealt with through demolition. So there was a moral judgment attached to these places. The people living in them somehow created the conditions around them, and that it was all about what you deserve, the place you deserved to live, and that you couldn't really redeem a place if it had got this reputation. To get cleared, you had to start again, you had to make it more rational. So this is one of the last projects to do this, building a great big street through the Clare Market slum. But this had previously happened in a lot of other places in London. For example, Farringdon Street, Farringdon Lane, through the Saffron Hill slum, which is notorious in Oliver Twist. So the Victorians tended to take this attitude of improvement, both through creating infrastructure, but also through incidentally demolishing the things that were there in the first place. So it was a double-edged sword in some ways, an approach that was, I think in retrospect, pretty problematic. Apart from anything else, they tended to see people living in slums as a sort of more closer to animals than people. So the idea of a rookery, it's not about people, it's about animals. But we'll find out a bit more about that, what it was like to live there, in a moment. So if we go to the other end of Lincoln Fields, we'll stop outside the old curiosity shop.
Was there much opposition at the time?
So right at the heart of the LSE, this is Clare Market itself, formerly the Market Street. And you've got a really interesting combination of things going on here. So the O'Donnell and Toomey building, you get a really good view of the roofline from here. It doesn't look like it's got a chimney until you step back and it pops up. And then behind us is Rogers Stirk Harbour offices, which are, I don't know really, kind of large. I think that's my name. It's the main office block for LSE with teaching space in it as well. So I think the spaces inside are impressive, but it's a bit hard to tell because they don't let you in. So it's not one of their publicly accessible buildings. So a bit more closed off, a bit more of a barrier, I would say. But here is a good place to think about the kind of place this was in the 1830s and 40s. So just over there towards Portugal Street, there was a chapel built, no sign of it anymore, but it was there in the 1820s and 30s. It was a dissenters chapel called the Enon Chapel, built by a man called William Holmes. And he served as the minister and looked after the place. And it turned out, after his death, that he'd been making money on the side by doing illicit burials. So he would bury people, or at least that's what he'd tell the families. He'd take their clothes, wash them and sell them, and he put the bodies under the floor of the Enon Chapel. And when he died in 1835, the chapel closed. It was discovered there were 12,000 bodies under the floor of the chapel.
Oh dear.
All illicitly buried. And you'd thought that would probably be the end of the story, but it's a very different time, and they didn't do anything about it for quite a long time. Instead, they rented the chapel out, and you could pay to dance on the dead. So they turned it into a dance floor, admission threepence. No lady or gentleman admitted unless wearing shoes and stockings. And it was only in 1848 that they eventually cleared the place out and demolished it. And it's an astonishing story. It's almost impossible to believe, really, but I think the only way you can understand how that could happen is to get the context of the city, which was extremely dirty, extremely smelly. So a lot of slaughterhouses around here at the same time, a lot of rotting flesh, effectively, and the idea that you could just leave a pile of bodies for that length of time, and it wouldn't be such a problem for people that they'd make a fuss. Tells you a great deal about the kind of place that this was and how far it is from what we experience in the city.
Of course,
now.
they used to use incense, in churches, so you wouldn't smell anything.
Yeah.
They still do something.
What did they do with those 12,000 bodies?
They were reburied, I think all in one place, in a cemetery out, I think it's the East London Cemetery, Tower Hamlets.
That's a lot
Is that
of
right?
bodies.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's a baffling scenario, really. So,
Did they have a mass burial afterwards, did they? To
this
put
is
them...
just what we were saying, yeah. So this is the intact part of the street system around here. But we're going to go through the archway round under this building, and the Royal Courts of Justice are on the other side. So we'll stop there, and that'll give you another idea of what was here before they started to build large buildings and knock down blocks. Yeah. And it turns out you can. So we're right down in the corner of the neighbourhood now, and behind us is the Royal Courts of Justice, but this is actually part of the redevelopment of the area. So before the Aldwych and Kingsway were built, this area behind us was courts and alleyways which are demolished for this. So in 1868 they cleared 450 houses on the site of this building, and they demolished a number of streets, including Bear and Harrow Courts, Chair Courts, Star Courts, Swan Courts, all very kind of medieval city names and alleys that came off the Strand. So the Strand has its reputation as being a street that was fine if you stuck to it, but if you turned off onto the numerous small alleys along it, it wasn't necessarily such a good idea. And those are some of these streets. And Searle Street, which still exists on the other side, had a reputation for crime. In general, it was somewhere that was described as a thieves' kitchen or a cadger's hall, which is terminology at the time. And people talked about poverty around here. In the parish which belongs to the church whose bells you're hearing, St Clement Danes, they described miseries of poverty and sickness in the plague quarter of Cairo and the Roman ghetto, which are beaten hollow by places in the neighbourhood of Clare Market. Very nightmares of poverty and disease. Nowhere in London is a poorer population to be found than that is contained in the quadrangle formed by the Strand, Catherine Street, Longacre and Lincoln's Inn, and the new Law Courts. So the Law Courts took a chunk out of that, leaving this area over here, which continued to decline reputation-wise. The Law Courts are by George Street, incidentally, massive sort of neo-Gothic edifice, best seen from the front really, but it essentially killed George Street. The stress of building it led into an early death, which is all but unfortunate. It's an enormous project, an enormous and slightly out of control looking building still, I think. So we're going shortly to stand outside St Clement Danes, but perhaps I'll do the talking I was going to do outside there here, because I don't think we're going to hear it in the church. So when we get to the church, if you look back along the Aldwych, you'll see Australia House, which is one of the two embassies built as part of the redesign of the area. We passed the Indian consulate earlier, and then the Australian at the other end was anchoring the street plan. But on that site there were two streets which were emblematic of medieval and Tudor London and of demolition that happened around here: Wych Street and Holywell Lane. So Holywell Lane was parallel to the Strand, and it was known as a street of dodgy bookshops, effectively. So you could buy romance novels, but that also included pornography in the 19th century. It was notorious for that. It was also somewhere that had, I think, just a generally dodgy reputation, because when Charles Booth sent his surveyors there, they seemed surprised to find there weren't any opium dens on Holywell Street. So it's clearly somewhere they thought there would be illicit activities available. That was completely demolished as part of the Aldwych construction project, ran under Australia House. And the other street, Wych Street, slightly further up, rounds an angle across the junction of Kingsway and the Aldwych. And that was the street that people saw as being the big loss when the area was cleared. So it had Tudor inns in it, the Rising Sun Inn, the Shakespeare's Head, which looked, and indeed were, I think, like they had been built in the 1500s, with overhanging upper stories and leaded windows, and a general sense of a very different era to the place around them. So it was an island really of much older London, and it had already been recognised as that when the demolition proposals started to come forward. So people wrote about Wych Street, and they wrote afterwards lamenting the loss of Wych Street when it was demolished between 1900 and 1905. So that's the sort of early conservation angle on the area. There wasn't organised opposition to the project. It was seen as social improvements right at the end of the Victorian era, I think. 20 years later it would have had a very different profile as an idea, as a piece of work. But at the same time, the end of the Victorian era is turning into a time when people start to value the buildings around them, the historic buildings and places, in a much more organised and effective way. So this is sort of the end of the Victorian era of demolition, where a lot of things were remodelled, cleared, without a lot of systematic thought. Wych Street is the last street to go in the Victorian era, effectively. And after that, the changes happening in London are different. There are different problems, different issues, but that kind of demolition, it's unlikely it would have happened after that point. I mean, of course, a lot was lost during the war, and bombing destroyed lots of medieval London too, but the clearance of big chunks of medieval London, churches and streets, pretty much came to an end with the construction of Kingsway and the Aldwych. So we can go into St Clement Danes, which is a good place to end up. It's open. It's called St Clement Danes because there's a Danish connection to the Aldwych, and it's thought that Danes were allowed to settle here in the 9th century. So it's a place that has a Danish association. Parts of London have Danish and Norwegian and Icelandic associations going way back because the connection with the monarchy and kings who came over to London is from that era, and then we've subsequently forgotten about that really. But this is the burial place of Harold Harefoot, who was King of England in the 1030s, son of Canute, and not very well remembered, certainly not commemorated in the church, but it's known that this is where he was buried, as far as you can be sure. So this is somewhere that's got significance for very early Anglo-Saxon London as a place where something started that became a much bigger and effectively dominant culture. It's also the RAF church because it was burned out during the war and rebuilt and rededicated to the RAF once the work was complete. So it's got all the RAF squadron badges laid into the floor. And outside is a statue of, well, there are two statues. One is Lord Dowding, in charge of air defence during the Second World War. The other is Arthur Harris, who's known for his pursuit of the bombing of civilian areas in Germany during the Second World War. When that statue was unveiled, it was extraordinarily controversial. People attacked it regularly for several years afterwards. It now seems to be forgotten, but he's perhaps the most controversial British figure from the era. So lots of things to see, but I'm going to finish it there, and I'm going to go and have a little show, which you probably want to do as well. But thank you very much. Thanks for coming along.
Well done. Very good. Very interesting.
If you want to know more about my books, which are generally available from all the bookshops and so on, I've got a website called tombolton.co.uk.